Everyone in the building knew him simply as the grumpy janitor. He collected the trash, cleaned the hallways, and rarely smiled. No one asked why he was dragging his left leg so slightly. No one wondered about the story of the burned scar on his shoulder. But when Colonel James Richards moved into the building, everything would change. Frank Thompson was 67 years old and had worked as a doorman at the Parkview Residences on Manhattan's prestigious Upper East Side for the past 15 years. His old, military-cut hair was now graying, and his once sharp features had softened with age. But the deep, melancholy look in his eyes remained unchanged. He seemed to gaze into the distance, into a distance no one could see. Every morning, he would rise at 5:30, put on his uniform, and start work at 6 o'clock. He was never late, never complained, just did his job. To the residents, he was simply a part of the building, like the elevator, the hot water system, or the air conditioners. Unnoticed when it worked, complained about when it broke. In the early mornings of winter, Frank would clear the sidewalks in front of the building of snow. In summer, he would water and weed the small garden behind the building. In spring and fall, he would rake leaves and polish the brass fixtures at the entrance. Seasons change, people come and go, but Frank Thompson was always there, working in the same silence. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," said Mrs. Miller, the young lawyer on the 7th floor, before going for her morning run. Frank nodded in response, but he didn't smile. He never smiled. As Mrs. Miller hurried out of the apartment building, Frank whispered, "Good morning." But the young woman had already moved away. He didn't hear Frank's voice, just like the others. That morning, as Frank sorted the trash in the downstairs garbage room, he thought of the new 12th floor resident. He'd only seen him from afar during the move yesterday. He was a gray-haired, upright man. He looked like a military type. Frank knew those types. He didn't have much, just a few boxes and furniture. Even the moving crew was surprised. "He has very little," one of the movers said. "He looks like he's always ready to move." Frank heard this and thought to himself, like a soldier. Because that's what soldiers were like. They could be called to duty at any moment, they could leave everything behind at any moment. Frank was like that once. His entire life fit into a backpack. That afternoon, as Frank was watering the plants in the building's lobby, the elevator door opened, and he stood before him, a newly calm figure. He was a man of about 70, with military-cut hair, an upright posture, and a sharp gaze. He wore plain trousers and a clean shirt. A small badge on his lapel distinguished him from the others. "Hello," the man said, walking toward Frank. "I'm James Richards. I've just moved to the 12th floor." Frank bowed his head slightly. "Welcome, sir. I'm Frank Thompson, the building's doorman." James paused for a moment and looked at Frank intently. A familiar expression crossed his eyes, as if he were trying to remember something. Frank recognized that look. He sometimes got those kinds of looks, especially when he encountered Vietnam veterans. A look of recognition, a struggle to remember. "Thompson. Did you serve in Vietnam?" Frank's face froze for a moment. He'd worked here for 15 years, and no one had ever asked him about his past. Newcomers to the building often didn't even know his name. He was just the doorman. How did this stranger, this newcomer, know his innermost secret? He cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. 101st Airborne Division, 1968 to 1971. James's eyes widened. He took a step closer. Frank instinctively wanted to back away, but he held himself back. The memories he'd been avoiding for years had finally found him. Are you Sergeant Frank Thompson? Ghost Thompson?" Frank's hands began to tremble. He hadn't heard that name in years. His teammates called him Ghost because he could be practically invisible in the woods. He was always the leader on patrols and reconnaissance missions. And then, that fateful day, that crashed helicopter. From that day on, the name Ghost took on a different meaning. Memories of those days, memories he had tried to suppress, began to flood his mind. "Sir," he said, pretending not to hear. "I know you," James said, his voice now a whisper. July 1969, Ashow Valley. Our helicopter was shot down. There were 12 of us, and you. You saved us. Frank blinked. The lobby had suddenly begun to spin. That day. Flames, screams, blood. And smoke. Smoke everywhere. That hellish scene, the stuff of nightmares he had night after night. "You must be mistaken, sir," Frank said, turning to the flowers and continuing to water them. "I'm just an ordinary soldier." "No," James interrupted. "I'll never forget you. Sergeant Thompson, you saved 12 people that day. You risked your own life. You should have received a medal." Frank put down his watering can and turned to James. His face bore an expression no one had seen in years. Pain, fear, and perhaps a touch of pride. "That's in the past," he said softly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must get back to work." As Frank walked away, he was dragging his left leg lightly, as usual. James looked after him, his eyes moist, his fists clenched. That evening, back in his small Bronx apartment, Frank did something he hadn't done in a long time. At the very back of his bedroom closet was a small metal box. He'd carried the key on a chain around his neck for years. He opened it and pulled out faded photographs, a few letters, and a small velvet box. When he opened the velvet box, the silver star metal inside gleamed faintly in the dim light. He'd never had a formal ceremony. It had been given to him in the hospital, while his leg was still in a cast. He'd put it back in his box, never to wear it again. He leafed through the photographs. Young, strong, smiling young men. Most of them were no longer alive. They were in Vietnam, Iraq, or simply lost to time. Mike "Shark" Johnson died after stepping on a landmine. Eddie "Professor" Williams survived Vietnam, but lost him to cancer in the 1980s. And Carlos Mendez, the man he loved most, his closest friend, was sitting next to him when the helicopter crashed. Frank had carried him, bleeding on his back for 3 days. But he still couldn't save him. Carlos died in Frank's arms an hour before they reached the American camp. Frank didn't sleep that night. That day in Ashow Valley played over and over in his mind. The helicopter was flying low. The 12 soldiers and the pilot were silent as they sped over the green hell. Frank sat by the door, gazing at the dense jungle below them. He was 22, but his eyes were those of someone much older. He'd been in Vietnam for 6 months and already seemed to have lived a lifetime. Carlos, sitting beside him, handed him his water bottle. "Are you okay, Ghost?" he asked. Carlos was always smiling. He'd come from Puerto Rico, and life was a fiesta for him, even in the midst of war. "I'm okay," Frank said, taking a sip from the water bottle. "I was just thinking about going home." "Home? Where was it?" "Iowa? Indiana. A small farm town. My dad used to grow corn." Carlos grinned. "I'll visit you when we get back, amigo. You're going to give me some of that corn." "Landing time in 5 minutes," the pilot shouted. At that moment, the first hit came. The helicopter shuddered. Everyone went on alert, readying their weapons. The second hit was even more powerful. The engine began to fill with smoke, and the helicopter began to spin. "We're going down," the pilot shouted. "Hold on." The last thing Frank remembered was the fearful eyes of the young lieutenant beside him, James Richards, as he plummeted into the forest. Then the impact, the flames, and darkness. When he woke up, everything was filled with smoke. He felt a sharp pain in his leg, but he could move. He heard groaning voices around him. There were survivors. "Is anyone there?" he called. "Can anyone hear me?" There were faint answers. Frank crawled through the smoke and found Lieutenant Richards. His leg was trapped, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. "I'll get you out, Lieutenant," Frank said. "I promise." After struggling for a moment, he freed the lieutenant's leg. He lifted him onto his shoulder and carried him under the trees. Then he turned back to look for the others. One by one, he found everyone. Carlos was the last to be found. He had been shot in the stomach and was losing a lot of blood. "Hey, Ghost," Carlos said weakly. "I think I'll have to wait a while before I can taste that corn." Frank dressed his friend's wounds as best he could. "You'll hold on," he said. "I'll take you home." The next hours became a nightmare. One by one, Frank found everyone. 11 soldiers and the pilot were alive, but they were wounded. An enemy patrol could find them at any moment. Frank single-handedly led 12 wounded soldiers through enemy territory toward the nearest American base. His leg was broken, his shoulder burned, but he knew they would all die the moment he stopped. For 3 days, they trudged through the jungle. Frank carried the wounded on his back, supporting those crawling along. He evaded enemy patrols, set ambushes, and found food and water. Each night, he cleaned the wounded, trying to keep their morale high. Carlos was growing weaker. "Leave me," he said at one point. "Save the others." "We're not leaving anyone behind," Frank said sternly. "We'll all return together." At the end of the 3rd day, they were found by an American patrol. By that point, Frank could no longer stand. After handing over Carlos, who he was carrying in his arms, he collapsed to the ground. Lieutenant Richards knelt beside him and held his hand. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. "You saved my life. I'll never forget it." Frank's last memory was the peace he felt as he looked up at the sky during the helicopter evacuation. He had completed his mission. Everyone was safe. Or so he thought. When he woke up in the hospital, the first thing he knew was that Carlos was dead. He had died an hour before arriving at the American camp. Frank hadn't been able to save his friend. The next morning, Frank woke up at 5:30, as usual, put on his uniform, and went to work. He was determined to act as if nothing had happened. It was a defense mechanism he'd developed over the years, burying emotions, suppressing memories, living only to survive the day. But when he entered the lobby, Colonel Richards was waiting for him. He was wearing a smart suit. He held a newspaper in his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," James said. "Can I talk to you today? Maybe at lunch?" Frank nodded reluctantly. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps it was time. The morning hours were torture for Frank. He tried to do his usual routine, sweeping the halls, taking out the trash, checking the mailboxes. But his mind kept wandering to that day, that helicopter, those people. Around noon, James was waiting for him in the lobby. Frank straightened his uniform collar, took a deep breath, and walked over to him. "Ready, sir," he said. James smiled. "Please, call me James. We're not soldiers anymore, are we?" Frank nodded, but thought to himself, "I'm still a soldier. I always will be." James led him to a nearby cafe. Frank had never eaten there in the 15 years he'd lived in the city. It was too expensive, and he was just a simple doorman. His salary was barely enough to rent his small Bronx apartment and meet his basic needs. Upscale establishments, fancy cafes, expensive restaurants, these weren't part of Frank's world. "Why?" James asked as they waited for their coffee. "Why do you live like this? You're a hero, Frank." Frank looked out the window. Outside, there were businessmen in expensive suits, women in elegant clothes, people bustling about their lives. None of them gave him a second glance. To them, he was just a man in uniform, someone who held doors, operated elevators, collected garbage. An invisible presence. "I'm not a hero," he said softly. "I was just doing my duty." "You saved 12 people. You got a medal." "Medals? What good are they?" Frank sighed. "When I came home, I wasn't greeted as a hero. No one saw soldiers returning from Vietnam as heroes. We were just reminders of a failed war, of lives lost. But you saved lives. And I lost so many more." Frank's voice hardened. "When I came back, my wife had left me. I couldn't find a job. I struggled with PTSD. I lived on the streets for a while. Then I found this job, and I stayed here." James reached out and took Frank's hand. There was understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said. "I went through something similar. When I came back from Vietnam, nothing was the same. People treated us badly. I remember spitting and screaming. They called us murderers." Frank nodded. He remembered. He remembered that humiliating return, those painful days. "But we still survived, Frank," James continued. "And now, they need to know your story. The residents, those people who ignore you every day. They need to know who you are." Frank pulled his hand away. "No. I'm just Frank. Frank the doorman. That's enough for me." But the determination in James's eyes worried Frank. This man, a former colonel, probably wouldn't listen. 2 days later, the Parkview Residences held its monthly apartment meeting. Frank, as usual, prepared coffee and cookies, then waited quietly in the corner. The meetings usually dealt with mundane matters like building costs, elevator maintenance, and lobby flowers. This time, the discussion was about renovating the building's common areas. Some residents wanted sleeker furniture and a more modern design. As the discussion dragged on, Frank stood silently, replenishing the tea and coffee service. But this meeting was different. Colonel Richard stood up when the agenda items were finished. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said forcefully. "I want to talk to you about one of us. A hero who lives among us." Frank's heart raced. No, please no, he thought. He wanted to retreat unnoticed to the corner, but all eyes were already on him. "There's a man we pass every day who picks up our trash and opens our doors. Most of us rarely thank him. Some of us don't even notice his presence." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at James. Frank tried to back away from the door, but his legs wouldn't carry him. The past he'd been running from for years now caught up with him. "Frank Thompson isn't just a doorman," James continued. "He's a hero who served in Vietnam. In 1969, he rescued 12 soldiers from a helicopter crash in enemy territory. Despite his own injuries, he carried them to safety for 3 days. I was one of them." The room began to murmur in surprise. Some turned to Frank, as if seeing him for the first time. "Frank has received the Silver Star. It's an honor given to those who demonstrate extraordinary bravery. And now, every day, he opens our door." James pulled a small box from his pocket and walked over to Frank. "Frank, they gave you this medal 50 years ago, but you never wore it. Now, here, in front of these people, I want you to wear it. Because you are a hero, and everyone needs to know it." Frank took the box with trembling hands. Inside was the badge given to Vietnam veterans. A simple, plain badge. But it meant a lot to him. Frank's voice was trembling. "I was just doing my duty." "And you still do," James said. "Every day." That evening, after the meeting, the building's residents came up to Frank one by one and shook his hand. Some apologized for not noticing. Others thanked him, both for what he had done in the building and for what he had done in Vietnam all those years ago. Ms. Miller, the young lawyer on the 7th floor, hugged him through tears. "I never knew," she said. "My father was in Vietnam too. He never came back. If he had met someone like you, maybe." Frank gently embraced the young woman, his hands still trembling. "Your father was a hero too," he said. "We were all just doing our duty." In the weeks that followed, life at Parkview Residences began to change. Frank wasn't just the doorman anymore. People talked to him, asked his stories, and shared their own. Young couples introduced their children to Uncle Frank. Older residents reminisced about the Vietnam era and chatted with him. One morning, an elderly Mr. Goldstein from the 3rd floor brought Frank a small gift. It was an old clock. "My father's clock," Mr. Goldstein said. "He had it with him in World War II. Now I want it for you." A gift from a soldier to another soldier. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Frank accepted the clock. "Thank you," he said. "I'm honored." Another day, little Emily from the 10th floor drew a picture for Frank. In the picture, Frank was wearing a superhero costume and flying. The caption read, "Uncle Frank, the hero." Frank slowly began to emerge from his shell. He smiled often, not rarely. His military-cut hair was still gray, it still dragged lightly on his left leg, and there was still a burned scar on his shoulder. But the distant look in his eyes was slowly giving way to a warm glow. One Saturday morning, James invited him to a Vietnam veterans reunion. Frank was hesitant at first. He'd avoided such gatherings for years. He didn't want to remember them. But James insisted. "Just try it," he said. "If you don't like it, you don't have to come again." Frank finally agreed. That Saturday, he didn't wear his old uniform, but he pinned his silver star badge on his lapel. It was a small step, but a significant one. At the reunion, Frank met many veterans with similar stories. Some had faced similar challenges, PTSD, nightmares, difficulty adapting to society. But all of them had survived. All of them, in their own way, had taken steps forward. Like me, Frank thought. I survived too. After the reunion, Frank and James went to a bar and had a beer. James told Frank about his life after his military service. After retiring from the army, he had worked for a veterans' rights organization. "I help people like us," he said. "Those who have lost their way after returning from war." "I wish you'd found me sooner," Frank said, half-jokingly. James smiled. "Maybe I found you just in time." One evening, after work, James was waiting for him in the lobby. "Shall we go to dinner, old friend?" he asked. Frank smiled. "With pleasure, Colonel." As the two veterans walked through the streets of Manhattan, Frank felt a feeling he hadn't felt in years, belonging. Perhaps he had finally come home. James put a hand on Frank's shoulder. "You know, you're still saving lives." "What do you mean?" "You saved my life. I was lost in loneliness. After I retired, I lost my purpose. But when I found you, I remembered. We are never alone. We are never alone. We are a unit." Frank nodded. He understood. For soldiers, loyalty was everything. And perhaps it was the same in civilian life. Maybe we were all connected, even if we didn't realize it. That night, back in his apartment, Frank opened the metal box in his bedroom again. He took out the photos and hung them on his wall this time. The young, smiling faces would no longer be hidden. They needed to be remembered, honored, their lives celebrated. A year later, Frank Thompson was still working at Parkview Residences. But he wasn't just a doorman anymore. To the residents, he was a friend, a counselor, a storyteller. In the evenings, in the lobby, he would tell the children war stories, not scary ones, but stories of courage and friendship. On Wednesdays, he joined the veterans group at church. And once a month, he and Colonel Richards would visit local schools and speak to the students. Frank's life had changed completely. He smiled more, talked more, lived more. He still had nightmares sometimes, still had difficult days. But he wasn't alone anymore. He was part of a unit. One day, when James and I met for lunch, Frank asked him a question. "Why did you look for me? Why did you try to find me?" James was silent for a moment, then he answered. "Because I was just like you. I was lost. But then I joined a veterans group, and my life changed. And I thought, maybe there were other lost soldiers out there. Maybe I could help them too." "And how did you find me?" James smiled. "Coincidence. Really. A friend of mine rented an apartment in this building, but then he had to move to another city. He offered to let me share his apartment. And one day, as we were moving, I saw you. I recognized that military stance. And then, when I looked at your face, I remembered you." Frank nodded. "I'm glad you remembered. And you? How's your life now?" James smiled and raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Frank raised his glass as well. "And to old friendships." As the two veterans sat in a noisy Manhattan restaurant, Frank looked around. People were coming and going, laughing, crying, living. And now, finally, he was among them. No longer a distant observer, but someone fully engaged in life. "You know what," Frank said. "Carlos was right." "Carlos? Your friend?" "Yeah. He was sitting next to me on the helicopter that crashed. Before he died, he told me he was going to visit our farm in Indiana. He wanted to taste that corn." "What did he say?" Frank smiled, his eyes distant. "He said, life's a fiesta, amigo. Celebrate every moment." And now, 50 years later, I finally understand what he meant. James raised his glass again. "So, to Carlos. And to live life like a fiesta." Frank raised his glass too. "To Carlos. And to coming home. Maybe some journeys never end. Maybe life was a constant journey home. And maybe, just maybe, Frank Thompson had finally found his way."